Okay, so thanks, Kate. I think, sorry if I just say anything that Kate's already said. I think she's probably explained that I can't hear anyone. But if you do want to drop a comment, hopefully it should kind of ping in the chat, because I've probably got no idea what's kind of going on in the background otherwise. So yeah, so I'm Jo. I'm a lecturer at the University of Bath. And I've got a background in computer science, which kind of led to psychology, but I guess I kind of class myself as someone that's self-taught in psychology rather than an official psychologist. So my background usually has something to do with looking at how people behave using technology in various forms. And so this is what I'm going to talk about today. It's some research that I've been doing for 6 years now, which has been looking at, whether it's possible to predict personality using machine learning. So this is something that's become huge in the last 10 years or so, and it has an endless amount of applications. So there's probably not a single person that doesn't use Google or social media to try and find out information about somebody, and try and work out what they're like as a person. It could be with the purposes of wanting to date them, wanting to work out if there's someone that's perhaps deceptive, whether they're a criminal trying to sort of scam you out of money. It's very important or desirable for businesses that obviously want to make money by targeting adverts. And indeed, it's popular for organisations as well, as part of the recruitment process. And that's something that cuts both ways. So it could be employers wanting to look up information about potential candidates, and candidates wanting to kind of work out who their future colleagues might be. So all of this information is accessible now, and it's an important thing to think about is that it's a combination of information that we give out to the world in the way that people try and craft images of themselves and present themselves in desirable ways. But there's also the other side of that, which is all the things that you click on and the behaviours that you do, might reveal things about yourself that you don't really think about, and that you kind of might not realise are being disclosed, or that can be picked up on by computer algorithms and used. So this work began back in 2016, and it was part of a project that was part of CREST, which is quite a big research centre now. It's been going since 2016. And this work is broadly concerned with social science and security research. So the particular piece of work that I was doing was all focused on digital data and personality. And the original idea behind it was, can we use digital data to protect people? Can we understand people's behaviours online? Can we detect potential threats to security, basically, from a kind of human perspective? So as part of this work, I was asked to do a systematic review that had some quite big questions at the time. And these were the questions. So it was, can digital data be used to predict personality? What types of data can be used? And if it's possible, then how accurate can these predictions be made? So it's quite a challenging piece of research to step into. You can imagine if you're going to look up something in a search engine, if you put Facebook in or digital data, indeed it brings up thousands and thousands of articles. So I went through quite a long process in terms of trying to locate research that had done this, but over time, it kind of got whittled down to a set of just under 200 articles. I should say it's a piece of ongoing work, so I'm continuously kind of updating this number and working on it. I probably will be doing for the next 5 years, I imagine, because it's such a sort of a big area to look into. And I'm just going to talk through a few examples. There's kind of, as you can imagine, the amount of digital data that can be indicative of personality is absolutely huge. But here are a few examples that you might not be familiar with. Some of them might be more obvious. So it is possible to predict people's personalities, typically in the form of the big 5 traits. That was the type of personality, the scales that I was using. So it's possible to predict from financial records. It's possible to predict from Spotify data, which can be all manner of behaviours on Spotify. It's not necessarily a product of the type of music a person is listening to. It can be sort of down to when are they going on there, how long are they spending on there, you know, their sort of browsing patterns, behavioural patterns, things of that nature. Smartphones are absolutely huge, again, because there's just a world of data on your smartphone. So it can be anything from your basic call records, sending text messages, how many times you pick up your phone, to other aspects such as your GPS location that's being tracked, or your movement data in terms of inbuilt accelerometers and things like that. So absolutely loads on smartphones. And then some of them that maybe more, if you are familiar with this type of work, that you might have heard of, your social media data. So there are loads of studies about different types of Facebook likes that might be revealing of personality, as well as aspects such as status updates, network data, how many times people retweet, how many followers they have, etc., etc. But those are just a few of them. And of course, back at the time, this was kind of, when I started looking at this, it was kind of before Cambridge Analytica became famous. But I did kind of learn about them before their activities hit the news. So these were actually some screenshots of their website that existed in 2016 that you can't access anymore because it got taken down. But it's quite interesting to kind of take this snapshot in time. And it showed that Cambridge Analytica were very proudly promoting that they were using the big 5 traits and machine learning to predict personality from social media data and influence elections. So this is at the time when the Trump campaign was happening, and they'd kind of had this evidence of other campaigns that they'd been involved in. And I did try and find examples of these adverts, of the type of material that was used on Facebook, but it was pretty much impossible. This is the best thing I've ever been able to find of what targeted adverts look like. So this is an example from a different political campaign, and it's 3 versions of the same advert that were specifically speaking to particular traits. So this probably seems quite obvious for psychologists that have studied personality, but it's trying to speak directly to particular traits. And of course, the extent to which this actually sort of worked or not is a little bit debatable. But at the time, it was kind of enough to get the votes that were needed to impact the results. Here are a couple of other examples. So this type of application of using computer-based predictions, you know, it is a bit of a topic that people worry about. It can create headlines, as we already know. This was something that hit the news last year relating to Spotify. And it was an article that was saying, you know, Spotify is collecting all this data. It was linked to a patent that listed all the different types of data that Spotify was collecting. And you can go and Google it. You can look at this article, and you can go and look up what's in this patent. You know, and it was kind of being quite sort of scary, really, saying, you know, it can analyze your speech, and it can pick up on all these behaviors. But it can then, it's not necessarily that they can target you with music that you like. They can kind of send you podcasts that might be heavily, you know, misinformation. They might send direct misinformation to you, or like heavily political ideologies, and it could be quite dangerous. It even said that it could influence your physiology, apparently. This is something that's not quite my area, but you know, if you listen to certain types of music, apparently it can change or impact your physiological responses. So there was kind of this outrage in the article of, you know, imagine having your heart rate being manipulated by these algorithms. But the extent to which that is possible or true, I'm not so sure of. But these are the kind of messages and things that come out in the news. And this is an example of one of the articles that did some research on Spotify as well. And then, of course, one of the most obvious and highly sort of desirable uses of these technologies is recruitment. It's never been something that I've personally experienced, but some people that work in particular industries I know get put through personality profiling tests as part of recruitment processes. So it's a highly lucrative business, and there's plenty of types of software on the market that propose that they can do these things and make companies work better and get them better employees and better results, etc. Again, but from an academic perspective, we don't necessarily know the sort of the scientific evidence behind how useful these things are. But what we do know, or from what I kind of found from the review of the literature, was that the accuracy of predicting personality was actually quite low. And in this particular context, it was usually measured by a correlation. So somebody would complete a personality questionnaire and it would come out with a score. A machine learning algorithm would be trained to predict personality based on a set of questionnaires, and it would generate a score. And then those two scores would be correlated. And the vast majority of the time, those kind of correlations were like extremely low. But this was kind of, as I found out, a reasonably acceptable level for sort of publishable work in academia. And it's also a similar result that's demonstrated in interpersonal perception as well. So if you have a colleague predicting your personality, and they fill out a questionnaire that's kind of saying what they think you're like, and you fill one out, and those two results get correlated. Those results tend to be or can be quite low as well in the personality arena. And one of the reasons why I think this is because actually it's really hard doing interdisciplinary research. And this is something that is kind of drawing from two areas or two fields that are very, very different. So all the things that psychologists are trained to do are often quite different from the things that machine learning experts are trained to do. And there's not really much sort of meeting in the middle. So it is quite difficult. But what's also happened is that obviously machine learning's a huge thing in many areas of life. One of them being medicine. It's really important for kind of making medical decisions, diagnosing diseases. And there's kind of a bit of an uproar within the medical community that the way in which machine learning is often reported in scientific articles can be quite misleading. So kind of being aware of these conversations that are going on in medicine, I kind of pulled from those insights and wondered if similar things were happening when it came to personality. So these are a couple of examples here of medical research. So this second one was a systematic review that was looking at medicine articles, and it kind of took an approach of analysing the extent to which methods were reported and adequate detail was communicated. It basically came to this conclusion that the quality of reporting and the information that was going into medical papers was hugely problematic, because it meant that studies wouldn't replicate, and you couldn't interpret findings properly. So it kind of mirrors some of the issues that are in psychology when it comes to the replication crisis, for example. So some of the reasons why this happens might not be that surprising in a way. Again, it kind of parallels some of the challenges that psychology has, but it's just a discipline-specific one. So one of the reasons is because to get a paper published, or to create a piece of research that looks good or sounds good, that uses machine learning, the goal is to create an algorithm that performs well, or that performs in the best way. So the goal to sort of get something that's performing at a high level of accuracy, might end up neglecting theoretical considerations that psychologists, would tend to think about. There can be a kind of, well, I suspect there can be a publication bias. So to get something published that's in machine learning, an algorithm has to reach a certain level of accuracy. So that could therefore lead to data being sort of chopped up in different ways, or taken out and rearranged here, and experimenting until you get the result that you want, but this might not mean that what it's actually doing is that meaningful. And one of the reasons this might impact personality is that, models are kind of only as good as what goes into them. So, they learn to predict something based on a set of data. You would hope that data would be good to start with. So you would hope that it's a proper personality scale that's valid and that's been well tested. But what I kind of discovered is that people would often just guess what personality is by saying, oh, I think this person's an extrovert, therefore I'm going to train the model on this set of data that I've decided is an extrovert. So it's might not necessarily be using proper measures to put into an algorithm. And it also suffers from this problem of, again, sort of the way in which statistics are presented, which, also happens in psychology. So there's this approach called classification in machine learning. It means a prediction categorizes one way or another. So often it's, it might be high in extroversion or low in extroversion, and it simply makes a kind of a binary prediction. Another way is to use regression that would predict particular scores, but people often go to an approach of using classification because this kind of binary output can make an algorithm look a bit better than it is, which might lead to a publication, for example. So all of these problems brought together means that the way in which this information is reported might mean that it's quite difficult to sort of disentangle what's going on in a study. And, you might want to therefore question the results of these findings that might seem quite sort of highly relevant and appropriate, quite shocking. But, it might be that you want to question how useful they actually are. And much like psychology, so psychology has the JARS reporting standards. There are some guidelines in machine learning that sort of say you should report all these things when you're writing your methods and you're reporting studies. But it seems that often a lot of this detail is missing. So the sort of foundations of this are what inspired this piece of work. So I took an approach that kind of looked at the methods that were being used within these computing personality papers, and then wanted to question, can we see how effective they actually are? Can we see if they're influencing elections or getting people to buy these products better than approaches that aren't targeted with personality? So the way in which this was done was to reanalyze this set of studies that came through the review, and to develop a set of criteria from which they could be evaluated. And so this is something that there were 3 of us involved in the project. We've got a little preprint of it here. It's work in progress at the moment, so I think we are still kind of working on it, even though we have been through a pass of analysing all this data, but I think we will kind of evolve this criteria over time. And we kind of, what happened is we kind of went through this marking process where we read every paper and scored each one against each of these criteria. And we developed this based on, what we think should make a good study. And we pulled from examples such as the JARS criteria and the criteria that exist in machine learning, and tried to sort of craft this appropriate checklist for personality. So every paper kind of got a score which was 1 to 4, or it's here basically amongst these. So I'm going to go over a few of the findings that we found. I won't go through all of it. But what comes out of it is, you can see quite well just by the way this is presented visually, is that in an ideal world, if everyone was kind of being really thorough with their methods and really detailed, we would see these kind of larger bars at the top of each category. But as you can see, they're kind of highly distributed, with large numbers of papers not scoring so well and sort of not providing information on their sample size and the approaches they used. So I'm just going to talk about some of these key points in a little bit more detail over these next few slides. The first one, which I think is really interesting, might be interesting for psychologists as well, is that the way in which personality was measured in the first place. And what we found here was that loads of researchers basically didn't use a measure of personality whatsoever. So they call it ground truth in machine learning speak. This basically just means is what was used, what was input into the model. So loads of people used things like MTurk ratings. So it was a personality measure. So it was the 10-item TP, but it wasn't. They were ratings that were created by MTurk workers on what they think a person was like based on a YouTube video. So the measure didn't come directly from the person in question. So it can be quite easy for that to be inaccurate in the first place. Loads of articles used Myers-Briggs measures. I didn't have all of these because we kind of rejected them in the search criteria, but it came up loads in Google generally. So again, it's one of those things that people in computer science wouldn't necessarily know, that the Myers-Briggs measures are kind of discredited. But you can kind of follow the logic, because this is still really well advertised and popular, so they would kind of pick up on it without necessarily knowing that. And quite a lot sort of had approaches of just making up what they think personality is. So I think it was this one here. They just looked at people's Twitter profiles and decided if they thought they were an extrovert or not. And sorry, it was this one, based on their number of followers. So if they had a certain number of followers, they decided that person was high in extroversion. So it wasn't really a good measure of kind of working out someone's personality in the first place. So there's a lot of misunderstandings surrounding that. And then secondly, a large amount of the studies that did use personality measures were using very short forms. So they were using 60% used 60 items or less, and we can see the percentages here of those that were using short form measures. Detail on sampling wasn't particularly good either. So, I mean, one of the great opportunities of using big data is that it moves away from the classic problems of having to recruit people in a university lab and they end up being students that are in their early 20s. You know, you can sort of get all manner of samples by using big data. The downside to this is there was a kind of not much of a recognition that this was an opportunity to kind of look into. So that type of information just wasn't available. Something else that's also really popular is that you know, when people do collect these big data sets, they tend to get reanalyzed and reanalyzed over and over again, which can be a really good thing because that can be really useful for you know, testing replicability. But it can also mean that in machine learning, they don't sort of think about testing new ideas or testing theories or experimenting in different ways because their focus is often on how can I develop the best algorithm that comes up with the best prediction, and it can kind of lose the potential of what it could be. So again, we see here the vast amount of data sets that were being used in this way. And then here we see, again, this kind of almost 50% sort of went for this approach of using classification, and around 40% using regression. So again, this heavy lean towards using these simplified measures of predicting personality suggests that algorithms that appear to work well might not actually work that well. And then we also looked at ethics and the level at which sort of data was made open and the transparency about it. Obviously, it's quite a huge, it's a hot topic. There's a big push to make data open, as well as to be transparent about what you're doing with that data. In some respects, the time at which some of these studies occurred was kind of before open science sort of came into play. But overall, the big picture was that these things weren't really happening. And I think back in my time in computer science, it was certainly something that we weren't trained to do. And as far as I know, it's something that people still aren't trained to do. Like, ethics wasn't really a thing. There was no ethics approval. You could just run studies however you wanted to, which is, you know, extreme contrast to what it's like being in a psychology department. But, you know, as we kind of move into this arena where you're using people's personal data and crunching numbers in all these ways, it's something that's really important, but it's just not hit in terms of scientific reporting. So yeah, and no pre-registrations whatsoever. So basically very low reporting in all those respects. So even though that picture looks a little bit bleak, using that information, we then sought to find out, well, what evidence is there for these personality predictions being used? How effective are they? And the overall answer is that I think there was only about 5 studies that actually tested this. So it was really kind of scraping the barrel for evidence of what is actually possible. It might come as no surprise that advertising is one of them. This is probably one of the most famous studies. So these authors are really kind of prolific within this area of research. So if you do look into personality and digital data, these are kind of like the pioneers in a way. So what they did was they created these targeted adverts that were aligned with personality, openness, and extroversion only. These are what the adverts look like. They launched them on Facebook, and they found that when they targeted these adverts, they produced 40% more clicks and 50% more purchases. So it sounds quite good. But the problem was, when you actually looked at the effect sizes, they were ridiculously small. So it didn't really paint a convincing picture of how good this actually is. Studies weren't also pre-registered, so what's quite interesting about this paper is that they only pick 2 traits. We don't know what happened to the others. Was it because that they did them really and then just omitted those findings? But we don't know. So it kind of highlights these potential issues. And with every single one of these studies, there was a kind of a big but every single time. Extroversion seems to be the popular one to go for. Maybe it's the trait that kind of gives the results. I don't know. This is another one, which might not be that surprising either. So it was, again, this was kind of trying to hit the political side of targeting in line with personality. So this was a Dutch study that was promoting these ads related to sustainability. And it was trying to test people's responses. So this was actually a lab-based experiment. So it wasn't a kind of real field experiment launched on Facebook. They were kind of fictitious ads that were trying to replicate the kind of thing that might be on Facebook. So people had to kind of then look at the advert and say, what you're going to vote, who you're going to vote for at the end. So you could argue that that's not ideal, but there's pros and cons to these things, and I guess a recognition that research conditions are limited. Downside to this one, again, they only kind of looked at extroversion. Again, maybe they didn't really, but it's the only one that kind of gave them something that was publishable. The computer prediction algorithm was trained on Myers-Briggs, so it might throw up into question how effective the algorithm actually was. And again, they kind of used this weaker method of using classification that had 61% accuracy. I suspect this is the kind of thing that perhaps wouldn't get picked up on in this type of journal, because it's not a heavily communication research here. It isn't a journal that sort of, I imagine, would have expertise on machine learning and the ins and outs of ideal approaches. So it kind of highlights those interdisciplinary challenges as well. I've got 2 more examples, and I think these are quite funny actually, because they're just quite niche and unique, considering that there's hardly any research out there. It's just quite funny what pops up. This study wanted to predict CEO personalities in order to see whether it impacted companies' performance. So they took social media posts And it is quite interesting. I guess this could be relatively, easy to do with the access to the right type of data. And they correlated people's CEOs' personalities with how well particular companies were doing. So they had a database of organizations, and they had metrics in that database of their performance measures. And what I thought was quite interesting about this one was that there was quite a lot of few traits related to various aspects, such as cost efficiency and productivity, but conscientiousness was basically not good for anything. So I thought it painted quite an interesting picture of CEO personality. The downside to this study was that they, again, sort of trained the algorithms on data that was not related to CEOs. So again, that kind of matchup might not have been that great, and it might not have been that accurate in the first place. And then this final example was about coffee machines. So via this study, I learned that there's an area of marketing that attributes personalities to objects and products. And my understanding of it is, someone can correct me if they know more about this, but is that, if products have personalities, then people with certain personalities might like products that match them because it's a reflection of who they are. But it's there's a whole area of research in marketing that kind of looks at this and can score brands and products accordingly, I believe. And this is where this came from. So if we profile products with personalities, can we then recommend them and match them up with people accordingly? So it was quite interesting. So again, this was using social media data to initially gather this information, and then it would take people's profiles, get their personalities, and match them up with machines. And they found that coffee machines did apparently align with people's personalities. The downside to this one was that they didn't actually get the real social media data. So the participants that they used in this study just reported what they believed they did on social media, which was quite a shame that they kind of didn't get the real data. So it was, I've completed this information on my profile. I've got this many followers. This is how often I use social media, rather than getting the raw metrics. So again, you can kind of, maybe question how effective that data might be if you're then using it in an algorithm and deploying it into the real world. So the kind of takeaways from all of this is that, okay, so we know that actually personality can be identified through all these different types of data. And there's many different ways that it can be done. But the lack of detail that's actually reported in relation to the methods and how it's done makes it really difficult to kind of evaluate, or it makes the findings questionable. I speculate that a lot of this is because of sort of publishing conventions that are kind of pushing people or influencing people to report results in certain ways because they want to get a paper out of it. If you do come across this type of work again, I think it's quite important to remember that a high-performing algorithm might not equal it's actually that good in terms of the psychological construct that it's predicting. What's gone in might not mean it's churning out anything that's relevant. And that there's not really any evidence, or it's extremely limited, of how these things translate into practice. So where could we go with this? Well, I think first of all, I think it's not necessarily all doom and gloom. It kind of highlights an opportunity for interdisciplinary research and how easy that could be with just a little bit more communication across disciplines. And it's not only that, it's kind of taking from areas like medicine that are also quite in tune with these issues and maybe taking insights from those. Taking guidelines and insights from the existing guidelines in terms of reporting research. And again, sort of thinking about open science and transparency. It is really challenging, especially when dealing with digital data, because we've been talking about this quite a lot over at Bath of, if you do take social media data, you don't necessarily have consent from people on Twitter, for example. And if you do make data sets available, it could open further issues in terms of, then how it's used and, where do you draw the line and how do you ensure people's privacy and ethics. So it's a real challenge, but I think something that needs to be considered and kind of become part of the conversation. And then I think my final kind of point on this is that this is not just a personality thing. Any area of psychology that wants to go into looking at digital data, digital-based research, probably also experiences all of these problems as well. So if anyone is interested in this type of work, feel free to get in touch and I'll happily kind of point you in the right direction. And then finally, I've just put a few resources, if you are interested, of some examples of this that kind of speak to the wider topic. So if anyone's heard of James Pennebaker, who does a lot of work on language, he's actually got a business that uses language to predict personality. So it's quite interesting. I recommend having a look at that. There's loads of others as well. These are just a few of them. And then these are some references that kind of discuss these bigger issues that are useful for personality, but like I say, I think they would apply to other areas as well. So I hope that all went through okay. I've got no idea what's going on in the background, but I'm happy to take any questions. Maybe there are some in the chat. I'll